And thank you to Amanda for arranging all the food and having that all organized for all of us, the snacks and the pizza. So thank you. And thank you to my wonderful partner, Candace, for listening to me talk about the content of this presentation for months and talking it through with me to help have it prepared for everyone here today. She can tell you that I've been talking about this a lot. And that is because I'm very excited to share the information in this presentation, while also a little bit nervous, because it is a very scary question to try to answer whether our movement for animals is stagnating or succeeding. And that is what we are going to tackle today, trying to answer that question. And I went vegan, I don't even know, like 3.5 years ago, maybe, or so. So I went vegan, and then I met my partner, and she had been vegan for 10 years. And I heard these like horror stories of that she actually had to eat like fruits and vegetables because like crispy tenders from Gardein and Daya oven pizzas didn't exist. So I remember thinking like I became vegan at like the perfect time because like the market was exploding for it. It was easier than ever, and like there was so much enthusiasm surrounding me about the success of the vegan movement that I was like, I joined this movement for animals at the perfect time, and I'm gonna get to see it succeed and enjoy all the awesome food. And it wasn't until I got involved in activism, which somehow was only like a year and a bit ago or something, so I'm not qualified to answer this question, but we're gonna try, that I started to really critically think more about whether our movement was succeeding or not. And what really inspired me to dig deeper into this question was a YouTube series called Are We Winning? And this is a YouTube series done by a guy named Jake Conroy, also goes by the Cranky Vegan. And he has been doing animal liberation advocacy for decades. And he was part of the Shack 7, who you may be familiar with. It was a notorious campaign to shut down a research lab. And he's done a YouTube series trying to answer this question of whether our movement is winning or not. And so a lot of the information here is inspired from that content. So if you want to hear someone with more experience and who speaks better say all of these things, go watch that after this. So where we'll go next is just talk about what is the current attitude in our movement. What is the vibe we get? Because for me, I feel like the vibe is that people are pretty enthusiastic. I mean, obviously there's the existential dread of what's happening to non-human animals going on in our heads at all times. But when we think about it, we usually have the narrative that the world is changing. So images like this come up on my feed like all the time and stuff like that. I just did a quick Google search of how great vegans were, and this is what came up, that we are the unstoppable tidal wave. And it's all across vegan news as well, because as a vegan, not participating in activism or really trying to actively answer the question of are we winning, I saw tons of headlines like this. All right, so we're winning. There's our answer. 10 signs that veganism will take off in 2017. Okay, so who remembers veganism taking off a year ago? And they're all over the place. So this is why 2017 was the tipping point for veganism. So you might hear that rhetoric thrown around in our movement a lot, that like we're approaching a tipping point, like where we're gonna have so many vegans and so many people in support of non-human animals that like we're gonna reach critical mass and like the whole world will become a vegan paradise. So we hear that a lot, that we're at a tipping point. And it's not just the vegan news outlets, it's even like Forbes Business telling you, here's why you should turn your business vegan in 2018. So there is a lot of enthusiasm, I find, in the movement about our direction. So as a vegan, just chilling, doing my thing, I felt pretty good about the movement I was involved in for animals, and even as an activist. But we're going to try to dig a little deeper today and answer the question of are we winning, are we succeeding, or stagnating? And I can think of a few different metrics that we could use to evaluate and answer that question. One of them, what might seem like the most obvious question to try to answer, is the number of vegans in the world increasing? Like, have we gone up in vegans over the years? And I know we're in Canada, and it'd be great if we could do a statistical analysis of Canada and whether it's increasing, but the numbers just aren't as available. So we're going to be focusing on mainly the UK and the US. So apologies for that, but let's find out if the number of vegans is going up. So 2 years ago, this headline flashed across my Facebook and Instagram and everywhere else. Number of vegans in Britain rises by 360% in 10 years. So that sounds pretty awesome, and I do recall when this came out, there was tons of blogs and people sharing this, like, saying we're winning. It's good to be enthusiastic right now about where we are in the movement. And we'll talk more and more about numbers as this presentation goes on, because doing the research, you find out that it gets complicated very quickly, especially because I don't have any background in mathematics. But 360% sounds pretty damn good. But we need to remember that veganism has been around longer than just 10 years. So the word vegan was coined all the way back in the 1940s with Donald Watson and the Vegan Society. So what happens if we look at the number of vegans further back than just a 10-year time frame? And if we do some digging and some research, we can find a survey from 1990 on changing attitudes to meat consumption. So they were just testing whether people ate animals or not, so testing the number of vegetarians. But they did a survey in 1990. And again, we'll talk more about numbers as we go on. It is very, very tricky to compare different studies because a lot of them use very different methodologies. And if you compare two surveys that use different methodologies, you basically can get some really wonky answers. Like, you need to test two studies that have the same methodology and the same metrics for getting a percentage of vegans. The data was hard to find on the methodology of these surveys, but I want us to kind of just focus on the narrative. Because when that 360% was increased, the narrative was that the number of vegans is rising, we're winning. And I wanted to know what was the narrative when this 1990 survey came out? What did they find and how did people react to it? So just to crunch the numbers for us, so number of vegans and vegetarians in Britain. So our 2016 study found 3.25% of the population was vegetarian or vegan, which would be about 1.68 million people. Now, in 1990, that survey found that 3.7% of the population was vegetarian, or 2.1 million people. So if we look in a 25-year time frame, just by these numbers, we would see that the number of vegetarians and vegans has actually gone down, and that we have less. Now again, we don't need to necessarily take this as gospel because we're not sure of the methodologies, but how did people react to 3.7% of the population being vegetarian in 1990? Well, they were pretty damn happy about it. So if we dig and dig and dig, we find Vegetarian Times 1992 issue. And based on that survey in 1990 and other numbers, they predicted by the year 2000, 20% of all Brits would be vegetarian. 1 in every 5 people they were predicting 18 years ago would be vegetarian and not eating animals, because they looked at the numbers and they said they're increasing, and they just assumed that the trajectory was going to be like this. And when I read headlines that say our percentages are going up, I assume the trajectory is going to go like this. And when I read predictions from 25 years ago, I get scared, very scared that we were just repeating the exact same narrative, and is it actually justified? So let's try to actually answer that question now and compare studies that have similar methodologies. And wouldn't it be wonderful if someone way smarter than me tried to look at all the numbers and crunch them? But before we get right into that, we're going to look at numbers in the US because that's where a lot of the data is. So how many people saw this video or a version of this article? Okay, I saw it a lot on my newsfeed. Veganism in America has grown 600%. Okay, and if you continue watching the video, there's the estimate that vegans now represent 6% of the American population. So that would be amazing if 6% of people around us were vegan. But just from that estimate, I mean, I don't live in America, but it seems kind of high. So on our quest to be committed to accuracy, we'll dig a bit deeper. So Live Kindly shared this, and they say, source in the comments. So we go to the comments, and Live Kindly sources themselves, livekindly.com. Okay, we'll click that. Live Kindly gets another click, good job. And we look at the article for the sources. And they source a place called Food Revolution. So now I'm thinking, okay, I guess Food Revolution did the study. I want to see the study. I want to see the methodology. So I go to Food Revolution. And again, same huge headline, 600% increase, 6% vegans, yada, yada. I'm like, okay, where are the numbers? And they didn't do it either. So they cite global data. So we're continuing to run around the internet trying to find these numbers. And we get to global data, who actually did the study. So very exciting. So let's check out the methodology. All we have to do is get the report, and it's just going to cost us $3,450. to view. So I guess we can question my commitment to answering this question, but I did not pay the $3,450 to view the methodology of this study. And I can't say for sure, but my guess is Food Revolution did not pay that either, and neither did Live Kindly, because nothing in their articles contains any information that I could not find in the free little summary. And what's more concerning is, one, the headline should make us a bit skeptical, because this doesn't even look like a study that was testing the number of vegans. They're exploring food trends, including meat substitutes. And if we read in the summary, we see that they're using the words like meat-free and vegan interchangeably. So we can't view the report, so we have no idea how they defined veganism, how many people they asked. Like, did they ask them in person? Did they ask them on the phone, the internet? All of these things affect these numbers, and we have no idea where these numbers came from. But it was good enough to put in a headline and share all around our Facebook and get millions of views, and have people like me happily clicking like, share, we're winning, I'll keep doing what I'm doing. So, remember when I said it'd be great if somebody took all these studies and actually looked at the methodology and compared them? Somebody did it, thank God. I'm very thankful that this article exists. I cannot pronounce this person's name, so I am so sorry. I don't even want to try, because I think that would just be insulting. But in a blog for animal charity evaluators, this author, who has a background in statistics, tried to answer the question, is the percentage of vegetarians and vegans in the US increasing? So he took all the surveys he could find, found the ones that had the same methodology, and compared the numbers to try to answer the question of whether it's increasing or not. So it's a huge blog. I boiled down some interesting takeaways that we can learn when we look at these studies. So important findings. This first one hurts. So around 60% of people who self-identify as vegetarians in surveys report eating meat when asked to list everything they ate during 2 non-consecutive 24-hour periods. Okay, so what does that mean? It means if you do a survey and you ask people, how do you identify, like omnivore, vegetarian, vegan, and they check that little vegetarian box, then you ask them to list all the different food items they ate over a 48-hour period, 60% check some sort of meat. And I mean, maybe we've encountered something like this, like your cousin says, oh, I'm vegetarian now, and then they're eating chicken. And you're like, what? So it seems like people are basically terrible at self-identifying and self-reporting what they consume. I don't know why this happens, but it's like weirdly consistent. Like all the studies, and this is why we get such a weird range of numbers sometimes, is some studies just ask for self-identification, and then they don't ask for specific items. So some studies self-identify, then list your items, and if you say you're vegetarian but you list you ate meat, then they take you out of the percentage number and say, oh, you don't really count. Other studies don't do that. They just ask self-identify. So obviously, if you compare 2 numbers that one used a more strict methodology, it's going to be a way higher number. And the ever-long debate about whether fish is a vegetable affects this as well, because an additional 10% did not report meat consumption during the 2 dietary recall days, but indicated they ate fish in the last 30 days. So if we include fish, who are an animal, by the way, for these survey takers, it's even worse. Like, we cannot trust self-reporting. And a last thing that affected that I already mentioned, so online surveys tend to inflate the numbers of vegetarians and vegans compared to face-to-face testing. So if you compare 2 studies where one was done online and one was done face-to-face, the online usually has way higher numbers. There's a number of reasons that are speculated about why this is. It could be that like a certain demographic that uses the internet more is more likely to be vegan or vegetarian, survey taker bias, all these things, but we're aware that it impacts the results. So let's finally get to the good part. Is the number of vegans increasing? What do we do if we compare the good studies that actually test it? So we do that in the article, and we find that around 1% of adults both self-identify as vegetarian and report never consuming meat. It seems that this percentage has not changed substantially since the mid-1990s. So that's for America. But what we see when we actually correct for these things is that we don't actually see a lot of progress in the numbers. If we want the good news, so the percentage of vegetarians has almost certainly increased since 1978. So we're doing better than we were back then. But since the 1990s, it's a little murky. And another good measure that we can try to answer this question is through Gallup polls, because Gallup polls have been consistently trying to find the number of vegetarians and vegans. They use the same methodology every year, so they're comparable. what they found in a 2018 one, just came out in August, 5% of Americans say they are vegetarians, unchanged from 2012. It's actually a little bit down from the late 1990s when they did these. And 3% say they are vegans, little change from 2% in 2012. And I know we think, and again, we can think that that 1% is meaningful, but this is where statistics bite you and get really complicated, because there is always a margin of error in these studies that we need to be aware of, okay? Because I know some vegans saw that and say that's a win, 2% to 3%. We're going up, it's going in the right direction in 6 years, but here's an explanation from Faunalytics on margin of error. I'll explain it, don't read that. Faunalytics, if you're not familiar with them, you should be, they're awesome. They are like an organization dedicated simply to looking at these numbers and trying to figure out, well, what is the most effective advocacy we can do for non-humans from a statistical and research-based approach. So, what is margin of error and how does it affect these numbers? So, obviously, we cannot ask every single person in the US whether they're vegetarian or vegan. So we have to do a sample. And that sample can only be so large. And if you ask 10,000 people over here one time and a different 10,000, there's going to be a bit of a swing in our numbers when we try to generalize them. So explained here, that 4% might really mean between 1% and 7%, or between 2% and 6%, depending on the size of the sample. That's why we can't read anything into a survey that shows 3% vegans versus 2% vegans a year ago. What if the 3% is really 1%, the 2% was really 6%? Then we don't know what we thought we knew. And to ask the amount of people required to get the margin of error down to 1% is way too expensive. None of these groups that do these surveys can afford to ask that many people so that we could be sure within 1%. Again, the good news, if there is good news, is that we can't say that it's staying the same. We don't have evidence that it's staying the same or going down. We just don't really know for sure what's happening. And some other findings from Faunalytics. I'm sorry, I know there's a lot of numbers coming at you, but we'll get through it together. So they did their testing in 2014 for the number in the US. 2% is what they found, 70 plus is vegetarian or vegan. And another number for us to key in on and keep in mind, 84% of vegetarians or vegans abandon their diet, because they are also testing for how many people go back. And I know that like a common vegan response that I've probably said myself is that if you were vegan and you stopped being vegan, you were never really vegan because you just didn't understand, right? But there is seemingly a large amount of people who want to identify or like did identify as vegan or vegetarian who abandoned the diet. And what this means is it's quite possible that we're living in a world, at least in the US and probably, well, I shouldn't say probably everywhere else, but in the US where there might be more ex-vegetarians and vegans than there are vegans. And that is a scary thought. And another thing to keep in mind as we go on is that about a third of those lapsed vegetarians and vegans maintain the diet for 3 months or less. So we lose a third of them in the first 3 months, and then we lose slightly over half within the first year. So if your friend or your family tells you that they went vegetarian or vegan, keep on them for like the first year, or we're probably going to lose them. So that's one approach to measuring our advocacy. Is the number of vegans and vegetarians going up? Looking at the numbers, it feels like the answer is we don't really know. It seems, if anything, it might be going up a little bit, but we cannot say for sure. So maybe we can try to answer our question in a different way. Maybe the number of vegans and vegetarians isn't necessarily increasing a lot, but maybe the number of activists is, right? Maybe there's more activism. We look at like Anonymous for the Voiceless, and their groups are exploding all over. There's so many now, so maybe activism is increasing. And that's a really hard thing to answer because there's not a lot of surveys measuring animal liberation activists. But one way we could try to do it is to look at benchmark events. So we can look at like a march, like an important march in year X, how many people attended it. So you might remember, if you were following in the news in 2017, so a year ago, there was an animal rights march in Israel that was very, very well attended. So this march had about 20,000 to 25,000 participants in Israel. So we see Joey Carbstrong, popular vegan activist, saying the biggest animal rights march in history. Okay, we made history, and I had to include the top comment because I think it fits this narrative we have that we're winning and everything's going awesome. That's huge! This movement is getting bigger, and nothing can stop us. Nothing can stop us. And it's not just like Joey Carbstrong. Like James Aspey made his post about it. He was there as well, another popular vegan YouTuber and activist. So the world's largest ever, all caps, animal rights march in Tel Aviv, Israel. 25,000 people marching. And that is why he believes in a vegan world. And every day we are one day closer to total animal liberation. And just to give context of these numbers, 25,000 is a lot for an animal rights march. In Toronto here, like we get like 1,000 for our animal rights march. In New York, they had about 2,500 last year. LA had about 800. And in the UK, with Earthling Ed and the gang, they had about 10,000 this year, if you're looking at the generous estimate. So 20,000 is a lot. And our final coverage on this march was from a news source. So 20,000 vegan activists march for animal rights. There's a nice picture there. And what has been described as the biggest march ever for animal rights. So I haven't been around that long. When this came out, I just took it for granted that this was the biggest animal rights march ever. But I had never looked at past numbers. Does anyone have any idea how well attended marches were in the 1990s? Maybe. Obviously it depends which march, but let's go back to 1990 and see how they did. So here's an article from 1990 in the Los Angeles Times. I'll just read the headline. Thousands join DC animal rights rally. Americans are urged to eat beans, not beings. So I guess the slogans haven't changed that much in 30 years. Organizers of the event claim that their movement now reflects the opinion of the majority. That would be awesome. If the opinion of the majority reflected an animal rights attended event, that would be sweet. And that would be even better if 30 years ago that was the case. But I think we know that hasn't really happened. And to get to the numbers, so Peter Link, one of the march organizers, told a crowd estimated at 24,000 people by the Park Service Police. So police running that event estimated 24,000 people. Organizers of the march estimated that 50,000 people were there. Okay? So maybe they were just being a little optimistic. But even if we take the low end of the non-vegan estimate, that's still enough to put into question this narrative that Israel had the largest animal rights march ever. And it just baffles me that this exists and nobody's talking about it, because it just seems crazy. And like, what was the attitudes then at that 1990 march? Did they feel like they were about to change the world? Were they talking about tipping points and these things? So we look at some quotes. Kathy Parker, who was there, the time is now to finally address the issue. Right? Like I hope it would be addressed. It's still not. And we also have that the movement plans to mark the 1990s as the decade for the animal rights movement. And they did wonderful advocacy in the 90s, I know, but we still obviously need to mark every decade for animal rights because we don't have the support for it. And
where was this march?
This is in Washington, in the US. And what's interesting, too, is that 6 years later, they did another animal rights march in Washington. And how many people do you think came to that march? 3,000. 3,000 people from 24,000 6 years earlier. What happened? Like, did they just advertise the 1990s march way better? Like, I have no idea, but answering that question is way more important to our movement than just assuming that it's going to keep going up. But we can't even ask that question if the narrative we're operating under is that our numbers are just going to continue to rise, because we've seen it's possible for them to go down. So what happened? I don't know. So I can think of one last way to try to answer the question of are we winning, are we succeeding, or are we stagnating? And that is the number of non-human animals globally being killed and exploited going up or going down? And if you're looking at the numbers, you probably already have kind of a guess as to where it's going. It's going up, for sure. So these other things we can't be sure of. The numbers are murky on number of vegans and vegetarians, number of activists. We know for sure that the number of non-human animals being exploited and killed is going up. Talking about in the last 40 years, we've seen it triple worldwide. There's estimates that meat production will double by 2050. And that's based on these lower income countries that traditionally haven't consumed animals are starting to consume them with more frequency. But a lot of the time people buy into that narrative, but it's affecting countries around us and our own as well. Cheese and yogurt sales are going up, right? Last year in the US, they had the highest egg consumption per capita that they've had in the last 25 years. And there's some predictions that the US is going to eat more chickens next year and this year than ever before. So the numbers are going up. And there's weird things that happen that influence this as well. People are eating less cows. Don't know why, for sure. Maybe it's because there's a big campaign against, quote, like red meat, and it's not good for you or it's not good for the environment. But what happens when people eat less cows is they replace it with chickens, and because it takes more chickens to feed people than cows, because you get more flesh from the dead body of a cow than a chicken, we still see the number go way up. There's more individuals suffering when people put the burden on chickens to consume. So what we see is that it is going up. And before we get into that, I'll say what it looks like then is it's really hard to point to a metric to show that we are winning when I see these numbers. And I think that it's enough reason to do an analysis of our current strategies and figure out if they're effective. And we don't have time to go through a lot of them today, but one I did want to talk about was leafleting, because I feel like leafleting really represents kind of movement strategy in a lot of ways. At least I know for me, my thought process when I went vegan, I was like, I'm done. Like, I did it, I saved the animals, I'm no longer part of this, like I can just chill. And it took years to like realize, okay, we need like activism to create social change as well. But I was kind of under the impression of how we create a vegan world is that I would go vegan, and then I'd give my friend the information that made me go vegan. They'd go vegan, they'd tell a friend, that friend tells a friend, and we do that, and one by one we'd convert the world to vegan until we had enough people to reach the tipping point. So that's what I feel like leafleting is kind of the idea behind it, is we just need to convince consumers to get on board. So how effective is leafleting? And that is a really hard question to answer, because it's hard to follow up with people. Vegan Outreach is an organization that did try to measure this very recently this year. So how they did it, they were on university campuses, which they typically target because younger people are supposed to be more open-minded and ready to be vegetarian or vegan. And younger people going vegan saves more animals, in theory, than older people going vegan because they're vegan longer. So what they did is they handed out 3 different booklets. They gave what is speciesism, compassionate choices, and then a control booklet. So whenever you're doing these studies, you need like a control group that you're not trying to influence at all to benchmark to know how effective your other booklets are. So the 3rd booklet didn't have anything to do with non-human animals. So they basically had people take a test on their consumption of non-human animals, take the booklet, and then they followed up with those people a month later. Take the same test of how many animals are you consuming to see if it goes down, up, stays the same, whatever. So they did find that both booklet groups showed a trend toward reducing animal product consumption. What they also found is that the control group showed the same trend. The people who read nothing to do with non-human animals also reduced their consumption of non-human animals, according to the survey. And Vegan Outreach didn't know why this happened. They said this could be due to survey taker bias, a random anomaly, or because taking a survey about animal product consumption leads to reduced intake over the next month. So we don't know why it happened, but when I keep in mind what we know about the statistics and how terrible people are reporting what they've consumed, it just makes me a bit concerned that people want to identify as vegetarian or they want to say they've reduced. How do we know it's true? Another thing, we're testing people after a month, and we know that over 50% abandon within a year, and 30% are within the first 3 months. So testing how many vegans and vegetarians we get in the first month isn't really going to tell us how many long-term, lifelong people we've, recruited for the cause for non-humans. And towards the end, Vegan Outreach did this, they felt great about it. They thought it was successful, and they actually referenced that Gallup poll that we looked at, and they say, however, they found that 3% of US adults now consider themselves to be vegan compared to 2% in 2012. That's a 50% increase. Okay, so they say, outreach should fuel a continued increase in the number of vegans, and at some point we should reach a tipping point where the number increases exponentially. That's not the narrative I find when I look at the numbers, but that is the narrative I hear when I talk to people. And I get it because we all want to believe that we are doing effective advocacy. And I've spent a lot of hours leafleting. So I want to know that leafleting is successful. And I just and another thing on the campuses, sorry, not to keep throwing numbers at you, but this is from a paper that someone named Angela Gunther wrote about vegan activism. So independent statistical research indicates that although college students have twice the percentage of meat avoiders, 15%, as the general public, college graduates have the same percentage of meat avoiders as the general public. So in other words, students in college are twice as more likely to not consume animals, but people who have graduated are just as likely. So her inference from those numbers is that basically there's a 100% recidivism rate from people who become vegan or vegetarian in college, or she considers that maybe it's the environment of a college that allows people to live as vegan or vegetarian and not so much the information. But it's just interesting to think about and more reason to be concerned about our methods. So I put this here to maybe make us feel better. This is a really common problem for nonprofits and activists alike. 78% of nonprofit foundation officials think their foundation is effective in creating impact. Only 8% can actually describe the specific types of information or pieces of data that lead them to believe they are likely to achieve at least some of their goals. It is really normal for people doing advocacy and important work to believe that they are making some sort of effective change, but when asked to point to numbers to prove it, come up with nothing. And to be fair, there is more metrics we could use. We could find data, and that will be probably part of the discussion as we talk about this weekend, but this is a common problem. So let's talk solutions, because that's more hopeful and fun than looking at these numbers, I think. So I don't have solutions personally. I'm not the smartest person in this room or anywhere. So I thought a good place to start would be to look at what did the researchers crunching these numbers have to say about making effective change. So we'll start with the author of Is the number of US vegetarians and vegans rising? So he had this to say after trying to answer that question. He said, personally, examining all this data did make me less excited about vegan advocacy. Vegetarianism and veganism have failed to get a significant traction in the US over many decades. The vast majority of people who try vegetarianism go back to eating meat. I'm not sure if there are any conclusions to be made about a reducitarian ask. In my eyes, this data mostly increases the urgency of clean meat research and corporate campaigns to improve farm animal welfare. I don't really agree with that. We're just seeing what people are saying about a possible change in direction or strategy. So this is from Jay Green, who is the founder and executive director of Faunalytics, so that group that is crunching these numbers all the time. And he had this to say, so advocacy based on education and persuasion is important, but it's also slow and inherently limited. We should rethink our reliance on these approaches, focusing instead on creating new advocate citizens and pursuing systematic change that can take place without the need to build a, quote, critical mass. So his perspective is basically that there might only be a certain amount of people in a population that will radically change their behavior, right? Like there just might not be that many people who can do it. It's limited. So his thought process is that we need to focus on these systematic approaches, larger scale things to get people more on board going in the right direction. And the last person we'll look at what they have to say is from the Sentience Institute, who, if you're not familiar with, they're a fairly new think tank who is basically dedicated to trying to reduce the amount of suffering in the world. So their biggest project is trying to end world animal farming, because that's where most of the suffering in our world comes from. And they put out an article saying, based on all the research they've done, this is what their number one recommendation would be for our movement, which is to shift from an individual focus to an institutional focus. We need to shift over 50% of the resources and messages we currently use to promote individual change, i.e. changing individual diets one by one, such as converting them to veganism or reducitarianism, to change institutions instead, i.e. changing governments, businesses, nonprofits, and social norms. We believe the heavy focus on individual consumption that we currently see in the movement fails to fully capitalize on public sentiment about animal issues and provokes defensiveness and opposition from the public, whereas a stronger focus on institutions would probably lead to faster, widely supported, superlinear progress. So, in other words, trying to change individuals and telling them that they're engaging in a problematic behavior provokes defensiveness. But public sentiment on animal issues seems to be that most people don't really like unnecessary violence towards non-humans. There's not too many people who look at the current situation and think that it's great. It's just a matter of whether they are personally going to make a change. So their perspective is kind of that we can make systematic changes that people will support if they don't really have to do anything other than agree that we can change it as a society. So rather than provoking individuals to make change, we work with individuals to make change. So instead of just having individuals attacked, we look at systems. And my personal plug for what I think we can do, I think we can see, is I think we can get very, very creative as activists, because we have a lot of tools at our disposal as activists fighting against oppressive systems. And someone way smarter than me, Gene Sharp, he was a sociologist and he studied social justice movements. And he read about all the amazing tactics that they had used to fight oppression. And he thought someone should write this down. So he did. And he put together a list of 198 methods of nonviolent action that were used in all sorts of different social justice movements in the past. So I'll just read some of them off because I know it's really small, and this isn't even all of them. It's only 80 that I could fit on this page. So, some tools at our disposal: public speeches, signed public statements, group or mass petitions, slogans, caricatures, symbols, newspapers, journals, records, radio, television, skywriting, earthwriting, mock awards, picketing, group lobbying, wearing of symbols, delivering symbolic objects, social disobedience, withdrawal from social institutions, haunting officials, taunting officials, vigils, all of these different tactics that we have in our pocket as activists to fight against oppression. And what I realized when I read this list is that I had put myself in a box for my advocacy, because actions by consumers is such a small piece of this list. And a consumer's boycott, number 71, is basically what I was doing with veganism. I'm going to not buy a certain product, was my thought. And then I guess a little bit of 72, I'm also not going to consume it. But why would I limit myself to 2 tactics of 198? And why would we, as a group in this room full of creative and smart people, limit ourselves to just trying to create social change through changing individuals like that? And I know that there's lots of people in this room who are already way past this and are pulling these different tactics from all over the list. Because we went around and introduced ourselves, and the wonderful initiatives that I heard that you guys are working on gives me much, much hope that we are breaking out of this box and looking at these different tactics to create social change. And I find it odd because when I share this information with people about, the number of non-humans being killed, the number of vegans stagnating or not being sure that it's going up, sometimes people get dejected, and I just find it exciting. Like, it is the perfect time to be a vegan, and it's an even better time to be an activist, because we have the wisdom of all the work from these wonderful advocates that they've done, right? People have been doing wonderful advocacy for years, and we get to learn from what they've done and how effective it was, and not limit ourselves to just the tactics they did. And we have license to be creative and get it done. So I know that a world where all animals, human and non-human alike, getting along and nonviolence happens is very, very possible. And my hope is that this presentation has motivated us to get creative and take action against oppression. Thank you.